First night at the zoo. You never know what's going to happen when the gates close for the night. When Kira Montgomery applied for a job at her local zoo, she had no idea what was in store for her. Since she was young, smart, and had previous security experience, she was hired as a park ranger, their version of security. Her supervisor, Eric Winters, was there to teach her the routines and maybe some about the animals too. Dressed in her light khaki uniform she'd been given when she was hired, Kira met Eric at the locked front gates to be led onto the property. She was slightly nervous but knew she was a fast learner, so she hoped she would do well. "Nice to see you again," Eric smiled as he let her in for her shift. "Same here," she replied. He'd been the one to help her get her new uniform from storage. Thankfully, her size had been in stock. He'd taken her on a cursory tour of the main walkways of the zoo. It had been a busy day and she had been overloaded with information on various animals, exhibits, and facts. Eric now led her to the little golf cart that they would use to patrol the zoo that evening. This is going to be fun, she thought as she smiled. As they slowly drove off along the paths and dirt roads in the behind-the-scenes spots the public isn't allowed to see, Eric handed her a map of the zoo and the worker areas for her to study. Kira tried to remember the landmarks and exhibits. An enormous tree stood in the center of the Africa exhibit. Next to the main gift shop and restaurant was an amazing waterfall. The smell when they neared the ape building was absolutely horrific. She was looking at it intently when the cart suddenly stopped. When she looked up, her jaw dropped slightly. In front of them stood a massive building that looked slightly like a barn. Glancing at Eric, she raised her eyebrows in an unspoken question. "This is our first stop of the night. Let's check it out," he suggested as they climbed out of the cart. She followed suit, leaving the map on her seat. Her expression was a little hesitant as they approached. As they entered the human-sized door, she was hit by an extremely powerful smell. She remembered it from when she was little and visited a traveling circus. It was elephants. The ones she'd seen had treated their animals well, though, not like some of the others she'd heard about. The ones she saw hadn't even allowed rides so the animals could rest, which she appreciated now that she was older. Just then, a massive, leathery-looking gray animal lumbered out of one of the enormous stalls into the open area. They were on the other side of the room and behind a strong-looking fence. Her eyes wide, she glanced at Eric. "Stay near the wall so he won't be able to reach you with his trunk," he said. She nodded and did exactly as he instructed. "This is Lox. It's from an elephant genus name, Loxodonta. He won't hurt you, but he is a bit of a handful at times." "I bet," she smiled. Lox stared at Eric for a few moments and then moved down the fencing and stopped right in front of it, in front of her. Raising his trunk, he reached over the top towards her. She was thankful that he couldn't reach when a sudden burst of air startled her and she jumped. Thankfully, she didn't scream though. She didn't think the animal would react well to the loud noise. Looking at Eric, she noticed that he was closer to the door than he had been a moment ago. Frowning, she noticed that he was trying to hold back his laughter, but was failing miserably. Finally, he lost his control and laughed, turning away from her. Wondering what was so funny, she looked at Lox again and sighed. When she looked down, she realized why Eric was cracking up. Her shirt was speckled with tiny brown spots. Lox had apparently just taken a drink after he'd nosed around for treats in the dirt, she guessed. Apparently, Lox decided that a change in style was needed, Kira said wryly. Note to self, bring an extra uniform to work. She couldn't help but laugh as well as she eased toward the door following Eric, who was still chuckling. "You made it through Lox's initiation. Congratulations. He only does that to those he likes," he told her. "I'd hate to see what he does to those he doesn't," she replied. He shrugged while still chuckling. "You handled it like a pro, though." "Thanks." She could hear in his voice that he meant that as a compliment. After driving a lap around the zoo in the golf cart, Eric received a call on the radio he was carrying on his hip. Ted Green, the director of the zoo, came on the line. "Eric, I need help out here at the dock. How fast can you make it here?" "I'm not sure, sir," he replied. "I'm training the new security person." "Well, we can't have anyone here that's not familiar with this animal on this incident," Ted replied. "Yes, sir. I'll be there in 5, he hastily replied, replacing his walkie-talkie onto his belt. "I'm sorry. Are you going to be okay patrolling without me? Well, you've shown me around, and I do have a map, so I guess I can patrol on my own for a while, she told him, not feeling as sure as she sounded. He nodded and smiled that she seemed so confident. I'll get out up here and let you take the cart if you're up for driving it around, he told her, pulling up to the curb near the employee break room, which also served as a locker room if needed. You trust my driving? She laughed. You may never get the keys back, you know. Heck, you might not get the cart back in one piece. Hopefully everything goes well and I'll see you soon. Go on, he's waiting for you. I'll give you a call on the radio when we're finished and you can pick me up right here. Don't forget where here is, though, he teased as he got out and jogged off to meet Director Green. Scooting over into the driver's seat, Kira sighed, wondering what trouble she was going to end up getting into, and then her mouth lifted into a brilliant smile. She was about to find out. Taking a deep breath, she turned the ignition key on the golf cart. She was handling it like a pro in minutes, driving around the employee parking lot. Thankfully, she learned fast, and the controls were not as hard to figure out as she'd thought. Alone, darkness swiftly fell, and she turned on the cart's headlights to see where she was heading. She'd hate to wreck the cart on her first day. As she drove around the perimeter of the zoo on the service road, she kept her eyes open for obvious dangers. Animals have always fascinated her. The zoo, now her zoo, has gorillas, chimpanzees, koalas, giant anteaters, as well as lions and cheetahs. She loved it already. As she entered the gate in the outermost quadrant to make an internal pass along the walkways on the inside of the zoo, she heard a cry coming from somewhere in the heart of the zoo. It sounded like a cry for help. What in the world? Had someone been left in the zoo after hours and was lost, not able to leave? The gates were locked. How could this happen? Should she call Eric? Well, he was busy with the director and she wasn't exactly sure what she'd heard, so she decided to check it out on her own first. She could always call for backup later if needed. Kira began an intense patrol of the walkways of the zoo on her cart. She wasn't sure if she was allowed to do this, but it was faster than walking or jogging to search for someone in trouble. She didn't find anyone, though, and was almost to the point of thinking she imagined it when she heard it again. This time it was closer and much louder. It was off the main path. How did someone get behind the locked areas? The cry sounded a bit off as well. Maybe they were trapped or hurt. She had to keep going. This area looked less used or kept up with. She imagined since they weren't being used, they weren't a priority to be maintained as much. Following a narrow pathway just wide enough for the golf cart, she found herself in a small, open grassy area with weeds, lots of flowers, and a huge mulberry tree off to one side, which was actually in full bloom. Scanning the area, she didn't see a single person, only a bunch of squirrels, bugs, and peacocks. Frowning, she got out of the cart and slowly searched the area for anything that could be out of place. She was silent as she did so that she could hear anyone if they were close by. Suddenly, an extremely loud cry for help started her. It was right next to her. She leaped backwards and her eyes grew huge. This time she watched as a peacock shook its small body and quivered until its long, vibrant feathers expanded into a full fan, and it cried out again. Pursing her lips into a frown, she slowly realized that it was the bird making the noise, and then she couldn't hold back the laughter at her own imagination. Accidentally startling the peacocks, which moved away from her, she thought fair is fair. They'd scared the stuffing out of her. She was just glad that they decided not to attack. Chuckling, she went over to the mulberry tree and picked a few bunches of the berries to snack on while she finished her rounds. Eating one, she realized why the peacocks were gathered here. They were amazing. She removed several handfuls and tossed them to the ground over near the vibrant birds. They all raced over to eat her peace offering. Smiling, she hopped back on her cart and slowly returned the way she had came, so she didn't get lost or needed rescued instead. That would be even more embarrassing. Kira managed to work her way back to the inner public walkways of the zoo without any major incidents. She needed to remember where that area was located so that she could go get a few treats now and then during the ripe season. She didn't hear the peacocks again, but that could just be because she knew their cry now and was tuning it out. Maybe they were taking a nap now that their bellies were full of berries. She smiled at the thought. Checking her map, she approached the educational building, her last zone to check. She was still laughing at how she'd been caught off guard by the silly birds. Parking her cart at the front door, she climbed out to check the perimeter of the building on foot. Testing each door to make sure it was locked, she came across one near the back that opened when she tried it. Surprised, she walked inside to see if anyone was there. The parking lot had been empty, so there shouldn't be anyone lurking around. Once inside, she found herself in a corridor with rows of doors off to each side. Most were probably classrooms, she thought. Peeking in the windows proved proved she was right. Listening for any sounds that shouldn't be there, she checked each room as she quietly made her way to the end of the hall, which opened up into a small auditorium with a tiny stage for presentations. Hearing scratching sounds, she walked over toward the windows where a line of glass aquariums sat on a counter. Moonlight shining in the windows was enough for her to see the little creatures inside. There was quite a variety, from hissing beetles crawling along their tank to naked mole rats burrowing in their nests. Raising her eyebrows as she read each of the identification tags, she decided to research some of the creatures on the internet when she arrived home. Sighing, she continued her patrol. She tripped over a child's chair but caught herself before falling to the ground. The noise of the chair scraping along the linoleum was almost deafening in the silence of the room. Phew, that was close. She hated to get hurt on her first day on the job. "Hello," said a voice from the direction of the stage. Kira's head turned so fast she was surprised she didn't get whiplash. No one was there. Narrowing her eyes, she was wary, since being fooled by the peacock only a little while ago. She wasn't going to overreact again. The voice sounded a bit odd now that she stopped and was thinking about it. Then she heard a shuffling sound and another "hello." Squinting her eyes, she watched a shadow move at an open doorway located at the back of the small stage. Carefully, she soon found herself at the open door frame. There was a different type of odor coming from this room. Glancing around, she began laughing and walked to the back where a large cage sat on a sturdy table. Then the nasally voice once again called out, "Hello!" Smiling, Kira cooed and responded back at the large blue and yellow macaw that stared into her eyes. "Well, hello to you too!" Ruffling its feathers and squawking, she chose to leave it to its own quiet time and exited the door she had initially entered through, making sure to close and lock it behind her. Finishing her inspection of the outside of the education building, she walked to the golf cart, smiling and shaking her head at herself. At least this time she didn't make a fool of herself and no one witnessed either incident. As soon as she sat down on the cart, her radio crackled to life. "Kira, if you're available, I'm ready to be picked up," said Eric. "I'm where you dropped me off." "Be right there," she told him, turning the key and pressing the accelerator pedal to drive to the back of the zoo where she'd left him earlier. Within minutes, she pulled to a stop in front of him and moved to get out, but he held up his hand to stop her. "It looks like you're driving well," he said. "Why don't you drive us back to the security office?" Nodding, she watched as he sat in the passenger seat looking pleased. He turned to her and smirked. "What?" she asked, giving him the side eye. "Did you have fun while I was busy?" he asked. She looked thoughtful for a moment. "I think I did fairly well," she shrugged. "I checked the perimeter and the education areas. Nothing wrong except that one of the education staff doors was left unlocked. I checked inside and secured it." "Good catch," he said, not sounding surprised. Kira frowned slightly at the look he gave her. "All right," she said. "Spill it." Surprise registered across his face, but only for a moment. "I'm not sure what you mean," he replied with the tiniest of a smirk. "I'm betting you actually do," she told him, biting her lip at the thought. When they arrived back to the security office, Kira went straight to the security cameras that were strategically placed around the zoo. She hadn't thought about them while she was out, but with Eric's odd behavior, she wondered if her patrol was captured on camera. Eric came up behind her as she rewound the footage to find herself frantically searching the zoo for the lost woman crying for help. And it also captured her encountering the parrot as well. She could tell from the recording that someone had been watching because the camera had been centered on her the entire time. Smiling, she turned to her training officer and silently raised her eyebrows in question. "You win," he told her, raising his hands in surrender. "It's our little initiation of sorts for the zoo's security staff. A little test, if you will." "And?" she said, encouraging him and motioning for him to continue with his explanation. "It's a good way of seeing what kind of stuff you're made from and how you'll react in an emergency before an actual one happens," he stated. "I'm sorry if we put you in a position where you weren't comfortable, but if it helps, you reacted better than any of the rest of us did." "So everyone went through this test?" she asked, not really believing him at first. "Yes, we did," he replied, looking directly into her eyes with a slightly guilty look now. "Believe it or not, I actually threw up after it was all over and done. Thankfully, no one gets fired if they don't do well. Now, if their reaction is inappropriate or someone or something gets hurt and they can't do security, they're offered a position somewhere else on site. So that's why it's only you, me, and the director here this evening," she mused. "Our security team is one of the best in the country, and I think this entry test is part of it," he nodded. "I can see how this would be useful and even possibly needed," Kira muttered. Eric let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He actually looked relieved. Are there any more tests or surprise events to look forward to? Her mouth hinted at a smile as he threw back his head and outright laughed. No more tests, he promised, his smile sincere. We do have regular evaluations, though, but they're scheduled so you know all about them. I was so afraid you'd quit. Why is that? Confusion evident on her face. I happened to see your resume while we were evaluating your responses, he admitted. I believe that you'll be rising the ranks quicker than you think. His shy compliment made her chuckle. I'm not easily put off, she warned. Let's get back to work. I have a score to settle with a few bratty birds. Definitely stay away from the cassowary then, he laughed. He's a handful. So am I, she smirked. So am I. Like and subscribe to hear more of these stories. Here's another one to enjoy.